Welcome, everyone, to the Kiel Institute's opening conference of our two new initiatives, of our Africa initiative and of our China initiative. At the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, we understand very clearly that we need to understand better what's going on in very important regions in this world, in Africa and in China, because we understand that those two regions, amongst many others, of course, will influence our own future and the future of the world in a very important way. When I was much younger and the world was moving out of the Cold War, many people were thinking about the end of history, about a future where differences disappear, where we all converge towards the same economic model, towards the same political models and social models. And I think now we know that the world has become very integrated economically, but we have not converged towards identical cultures and political models and economic models. And for us in the world of research, this is potentially good news, because this gives us variation, interesting differences that need to be studied, and it requires us to understand how these differences interact with each other, how they shape outcomes in all different domains at home, in Germany, and throughout the world. And that's why the Kiel Institute tries to build expertise, tries to act as a platform, tries to improve our understanding in the areas of African economics, African politics, and the interaction of the two, plus China and Chinese economics, Chinese politics, and the interaction of these two, and of course always with the lens of the entire world. We are the Institute for the World Economy, and so we're interested in understanding the role of Africa and of China in the context of the world economy, which is so important, of course, for our own open economy, and that's why we think hosting such an initiative at the Kiel Institute is a very good thing. We want these initiatives, the two of them, to act as platforms, to bring researchers together, to bring them together from different places, different universities, different countries, different backgrounds, so that we can learn together and work together to develop solutions for policymakers. We want this platform to be a platform that is about dialogue, about exchange, and about collaboration. And that's why I'm very happy that amongst the 320 or more registered participants to this online conference, we have many from the academic world, many scholars and scientists, but we have also many participants who come from the realm of politics. This is what the Kiel Institute stands for. We want to act as agents of transfer. We want to transport insights that scholars around the world produce into the political world. We believe that we can, through the scientific work that we undertake together in this platform and our other networks, that we can help towards making the world a little bit better. That we are motivated by this hope that we can contribute there. The Kiel Institute hosts this initiative, but as I said, we want this to be a platform. We want many of you, and all of you essentially who are here, but more, the entire community who works on African or Chinese questions, to use us and to use these initiatives as a platform. We want to host conferences and workshops. We want to carry out projects together, and we want to engage into outreach activities at every level, be it the media, be it the different stakeholders around, be it politicians here in Germany, in Europe, and worldwide, or be it the big institutions who deal with the questions of global governance and of questions that are raised by the roles of Africa or China in the world economy. This platform character is very important to us. And we will be very happy to have all of you in Kiel in the very close future. We're doing this conference as a virtual event, and I'm happy that we have the technologies to do so. And I'm grateful for all who helped us set up this event today. But of course, interaction, collaboration, networking, so much depends on personal contacts. And that's why I would already now like to extend an invitation to all of you to come to Kiel or to any other place where we convene, so that we can make direct contact and make these two initiatives a success. Today's program is about a combination of these two initiatives that we're launching today, of the African and the Chinese initiatives. It is very interesting to understand the role that Africa plays in Chinese economic strategies of the government, of firms, of other stakeholders, and conversely, the hopes and possibilities that might materialize in Africa regarding involvement of China. And I'm very happy that Rainer Thiele, who is at our research center at the Kiel Institute that deals with development economics and who is one of Germany's leading African experts, has teamed up with Andy Fuchs, who is a professor at Göttingen University, but used to be at the Kiel Institute before, and who is one of Germany's leading scholars on the economics of China. Happy that the two of you cooperate together and bring this event live to us. Let me also, before I hand over to our charming moderator, Kachana, let me also thank our great speakers. I know some of you, but not all of you. And I'm very happy that you have agreed to be here today with us. And I'm looking forward to a certainly insightful conference and to a future cooperation in the context of these two new Kiel Institute initiatives. Thanks for being here. I'm proud of what we can achieve together. Let's get started with our conference. Thank you.
Okay, I think it's up to me now to chair the next session. So I'm not Kachana, unfortunately, but I will do my best to lead you through the next part of the program. So maybe I can briefly, for all of you, recall the program, which consists of two paper sessions, one on Chinese loan contracts and one on trade between Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and I will chair the first one and will directly hand over afterwards to Andy, who is chairing the second one. And yeah, let's directly jump into the first session on Chinese loans, and I'm happy that we have two very good and very suitable speakers here. So on the one hand, we have Bradley Parks, who will start with his presentation. Bradley has a PhD in international relations from the LSE and is now executive director of the Aid Data Research Lab at College of William and Mary in the US. So this is a very important initiative, and it's also very important as regards our planned initiatives, because it enabled quite a lot of research already on Africa, on China, and also on China in Africa. So this is really fitting very well to our initiatives, and it will also, I'm sure it will in the future also lead to very fruitful debates and also research outcomes. The second input will come from Yan Wang, who holds a PhD from Cornell. She is currently a consultant at the World Bank and a non-resident research fellow at the Global Development Policy Center in Boston. And she is also a senior visiting fellow at the Institute of New Structural Economics in Peking, at the Peking University, which this institute is headed by Justin Lin, whom you later will see in our panel session. Okay, I think without much more ado, I will hand over to Brad for his presentation. Brad, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. And I appreciate the conference organizers giving me this opportunity to share some new findings from a joint collaboration with several colleagues who are listed here. Scott Morris from CGD, Sebastian Horn from the Kiel Institute, Anna Gelpern from Georgetown Law, and Christoph Trebisch from Kiel University and the Kiel Institute. These are preliminary findings. This is a relatively new project, so we're excited to get some feedback on what we're beginning to see. All right, so just to kind of motivate the project, as many of you are probably aware, the COVID-19 pandemic really brought forward a kind of latent conflict between official creditors outside of China and official creditors inside China. So the G20 called for the debt service suspension initiative, essentially looking for a moratorium on loan payments from the world's poorest countries. And Beijing's response really kind of induced, I guess, almost a sense of from the other creditors of just being completely incredulous that Beijing said, yes, we will participate, but China Development Bank, a state-owned bank that lends to developing countries, they will not be subject, they will not participate in DSSI. And then to the extent that China Exim Bank is engaged in commercial lending, those activities may be shielded from the DSSI. So the basic sort of proposition is, look, we may be state-owned banks, but we do a lot of commercial lending, and therefore this initiative, which is an initiative of official creditors and geared towards official credit, really should not apply to us. So this really kind of highlights a simmering conflict. And so one of the reasons that we pursued this project is to kind of understand the lending practices of Chinese state-owned banks at a higher level of granularity. We want to peer inside loan contracts and get a better sense of how these banks behave. Does their rhetoric match the reality? Do they lend like commercial creditors? Do they lend like official creditors, or some hybrid thereof? So the way that we tackled this is kind of piggybacking on an initiative underway at AData. So some of you may know that the research lab that I lead has already publicly released a data set looking at Chinese government finance development projects around the world. And that data set currently covers about 138 countries and covers the time period of 2000 to 2014. But over the last, I guess, 24 months, we've substantially revised the methodology such that it's much more reliant on official sources. Specifically, we're relying more heavily on the information recorded in the aid and debt information management systems of borrower countries, as well as official sources in China. And as a result of that, we have uncovered a substantial number of Chinese loan contracts. And so that is really what kind of inspired this project, the availability of the verbatim loan contracts. In some cases, we're talking about 300-page legal agreements between the creditor and the borrower. And I should say, AData is tentatively planning to release its updated data set, which will cover probably somewhere in the ballpark of 160 or 170 countries through the end of calendar year 2017 or 2018. But these legal agreements, these loan contracts, are some of the underlying sources that AData is drawing upon for the larger data set update that will come at the end of the year. We have 83 of these loan contracts. I'll tell you a little bit more about the composition of the sample in a moment. But one of the that Anna and Sebastian, Christoph and Scott immediately agreed upon is, okay, if we're going to try to judge the behavior of Chinese state-owned banks, we need to have benchmarks to be able to make apples-to-apples comparisons. So we thought, where could we find a kind of benchmarking sample? And we became aware of one particular country that has made public, it's not easy to find, but they have made public the universe of all loan contracts that they have entered into with bilateral creditors, DAC and non-DAC, multilateral creditors, and commercial creditors. That is Cameroon. So they have put all 142 loan contracts that they have entered into the public domain. And so we use these loan contracts to benchmark the terms and conditions in Chinese contracts to those of their peers in the development finance market. This is just a snapshot or a picture of one of them. This is a $2 billion loan agreement from China to from ICBC, Chinese state-owned commercial bank, and China Development Bank. It's a syndicated loan to the Republic of Argentina, and I believe this is supporting a dam, a large dam. Although don't hold me to that. The next slide just gives you a sense of what some of the other loan agreements look like. These are just 3 China Exim Bank loan agreements. They include highly concessional loans. They also include export buyers credit. So the one in the middle is a preferential buyers credit agreement. To give you a sense of the geographical distribution of the Chinese loans, this is where we have loan contracts. So this is a conference about Africa. You could see there's a decent amount of coverage in Africa, but we also draw from loans in Latin America, in Central and Eastern Europe, and a little bit in Asia. And then to just give you a sense of the cross-creditor distribution, it is unfortunately quite skewed towards China Exim Bank. We do have some coverage from CDB and the state-owned commercial banks, but this is potentially an area where there's scope for improvement, just to gain greater confidence in the inferences that we're drawing. In the benchmarking sample from Cameroon, as I said before, we have 142 loan contracts. They come from multilateral, bilateral, and commercial creditors, and here you can see the distribution. It's skewed towards multilateral, but there are a non-trivial number of DAC bilateral, non-DAC bilateral, and commercial creditors. And then this just gives you, at a glance, a view of some of the creditors in that benchmarking sample for Cameroon, so it's quite diverse. So how did we approach this? What we did was turns out if you are in the business of official lending, there is a template that you can buy. So there's an entity in London called the Loan Market Association that has loan agreement templates. So if you're getting into the business of official lending, you can buy this template. And in fact, many official creditors use the template and then sort of make deviations from it, but it is kind of the starting point. So if you're opening up a 300-page loan agreement and thinking about how are we going to systematically compare the terms and conditions, this template provides kind of a nice structure. So we have 81 variables in the kind of mini data set that we've created for each and every one of the loans, and they're grouped into these 8 categories. So you can see, it captures things like the cost of utilization, if there are guarantees and securities, governing law, and in the event of a dispute, where do you enforce these contracts? And then we had 2 teams independently go through the entire China loan sample and then the entire benchmarking sample using the same code book with the same 81 variables. Just to try to ensure that we could systematically identify any discrepancies between coding team 1 and coding team 2, and then reconcile any differences between the two. So there is a lot of findings that are emerging, and I'm just going to highlight several that I think merit special scrutiny. They relate to seniority of debt, security, in the sense of having a formal security interest or collateral. And then the third is confidentiality. And I'll go in that order. So we'll start with seniority. So this is all about who gets repaid first. And what we see is that most of the Chinese loans in our sample rank at least pari passu, which means they're on equal footing with other creditors. They're not more senior or less senior than another lender. We do find in a handful of loans, both of the ones that I highlight here involve a state-owned commercial bank, ICBC, effort to try to claim seniority over other debts. So you can see in the first example from Argentina, in the red text, it says this debt will have priority and won't be subject to any prior classification or of equality of conditions. And the second one, which is for a very large loan to Sierra Leone, says, this loan will not be subject to any prior ranking or pari passu ranking security. You'll also see in the second quote from the Sierra Leone agreement, this reference to transaction security. And we're going to come back to this. We're going to come back to this in the section that where we talk about collateral. So transaction security, the use of this term basically means that the creditor is claiming first dibs on collateral. They're saying, we have the first priority security interest. So basically, if you think about this from the perspective of a Chinese bank, they want to avoid being in a situation where they have a junior lien, right? So which would only entitle you to leftovers from the sale after a senior lien has been paid in full. So we'll come back to this in a moment, but one of the seniority, security, and confidentiality issues are sort of all tied up in a sense, because the challenge with having a formal enforceable security interest is that it requires a threshold level of transparency. You have to basically put the world on notice ex ante that you have first dibs on the asset of interest. Secret liens are unenforceable vis-a-vis competing claims. This is the whole reason why mortgages are recorded. You can't just say, I have first dibs on this collateral. You have to tell the world that that is the case, or it's very difficult to enforce. And so the enforceability of security interests, we'll come back to that in a moment, but you can see here kind of right in the verbatim text of the loan agreement that the seniority issues and the security issues are sort of closely entangled. And the opacity or the secrecy of Chinese loans in some ways put them at a disadvantage when it comes time to enforcing a formal security interest. And talk about one of the ways that Chinese creditors try to kind of compensate for that weakness. Another sort of odd feature of these loan agreements is there are a large number of CDB or a large proportion of CDB and China Exim Bank loan agreements explicitly prohibit any rescheduling in collaboration or coordination with the Paris Club. So as you can see in our benchmarking sample, not a single loan contract from the multilateral, bilateral, or commercial cohort makes such a claim. So that is also a kind of unusual feature that immediately popped out of the sample. Okay, skipping ahead to collateralization and more generally, just what tools does China have at its disposal to increase the probability of repayment? One of the things that we find in these contracts is that it's actually pretty rare, as far as we can tell, for Chinese creditors to collateralize on kind of fixed assets. And so what they seem to prefer is what you might think of as flow collateral, or securitizing a future revenue stream. And I'll give you an example of this in a moment, but it could be the proceeds from commodity exports, or if a project is revenue generating, those revenues will be deposited in an escrow account or a special account, and that is cash. You can think of it as grab and go cash for the creditor. So rather than going to court, it's a pain, right, to try to enforce a formal security interest, right? You have to secure a court judgment, and then you have to get enforcement of the judgment. So a compensating mechanism for that is to have these monies deposited in a cash account, an escrow account or a special account that is typically in Beijing, so that the creditor can grab and go in a bad situation where their debt is not being repaid. Okay, this is just an example from a $1 billion loan to Ecuador, where essentially there's multiple contracts going on. One is between the Ministry of Finance and China Development Bank, but then there's a parallel contract between China's state-owned oil company and Ecuador's state-owned oil company, and the proceeds from oil sales are deposited in this thing called a proceeds account that sits in Beijing, and that is what's serving as collateral. In the event of default, that is where CDB can, that's where they can turn. And it's very important that the asset, the cash asset, is in Beijing. You know, when we've learned through talking to lawyers that work on sovereign debt, that asset location matters in many cases more than governing law or the arbitration venue, because of this kind of grab-go dynamic that I previously mentioned. But there's a key caveat.
2 minutes left.
Okay. There's a key caveat. Okay. There's a key caveat, and that is that some of these loan contracts reference security documents. They cross-reference a security document. So this is a $659 million loan agreement to a special purpose vehicle in Sierra Leone, which then got a sovereign guarantee from Sierra Leone's Ministry of Finance and Economic Development. It references collateralizing on a mortgage agreement, but we don't have access to the mortgage agreement. So if you can't see the linked documents, you don't actually know what the asset is, which is a challenge. Another unique feature of Chinese loans, not unique to all creditors, but unique relative to DAC and multilateral creditors, is the use of cross-default or cross-cancellation clauses, where if you default on this loan, you automatically default on other loans. And, you know, I'll just briefly give you an example. In Argentina, you know, they signed a $4.7 billion loan in 2014. The loan agreement said if you cancel this project, a $2 billion loan for a railway project will be canceled. A new government comes to power. They announce they're going to cancel the dam project. And what does CDB do? They activate the clause in the loan agreement. And here is the verbatim letter from CDB putting the borrower on notice, saying, if you go ahead and cancel this contract, just be aware, go back and reread the terms and conditions, because you will automatically trigger a cancellation or a default of another loan. And then the Macri administration backed down. They backed down on their threat to cancel the loan. So these terms and conditions really do matter. Another unique feature of Chinese loans is the frequency with which they include confidentiality clauses. There is a kind of backdoor out, and that is, if you look at the red text, many of these contracts will say you have to keep the terms and conditions confidential unless you are required to disclose them by applicable law. So many of the loan agreements that we have obtained have been obtained because governments are required by law to publish them to a registry, right? So that is that's fairly important, and transparency really matters. Just to give you a concrete example of this, in the case of a very large pair of loans to the government of Kenya for the standard gauge railway, this railway was a political asset originally for the government. The president himself identified himself as the project owner. He said, we're going to finish this project by the time I stand for re-election in August 2017. He won the vote narrowly, and election observers after the fact said that the railway was one of the important deliverables that helped him get reelected. But everything turned in a different direction. In December 2018, that political asset, because of the opacity of Chinese debt, turned into a political liability. A letter was leaked from Kenya's Auditor General, and it basically said the Port of Mombasa's assets were sources of collateral that could be seized in the event that the Kenyan government could not repay its loans to China Exim Bank. That was potentially not even true, but the mere possibility that Beijing would seize a strategic asset like the Port of Mombasa provoked a public outcry, forced the executive branch into a defensive posture. And this project, which was a political asset, became a liability, became a focal point for public scorn and political opposition. Public sentiment towards China and Kenya soured after this happened. President Kenyatta tries to literally go back to the bank to try to get more money for the same project. And the banks see the domestic writing on the wall in Kenya, and they deny his request. So the fact that these loan conditions are not transparent can really come back to bite the borrower and the creditor. And just briefly, kind of major takeaways from this project thus far. One is that China appears to be more aggressive about protecting its interests. So in some ways, its behavior is more like a commercial creditor, but we also have to remember China has way more at stake than other official creditors, right? They're lending far more, doing a lot more sovereign lending, and they're going out of their way to make sure that they maximize the probability of getting these loans repaid. Another takeaway is this gap between perceptions and reality in China's collateralization practices. And then, I will just say, looking at all these loan contracts, China's not alone in the lack of transparency of these terms and conditions. Official credit from bilateral sources is generally not transparent, but we kind of think of China as, in some ways, like the worst among equals in this particular category. And then just final caveats, there are lots of Exim Bank contracts in our sample. We have fewer from CDB and state-owned commercial banks. That's a clear area for improvement going forward. We also, our benchmarking data come from a low-income country. We would like to get benchmarking data from an emerging market economy so that we have greater confidence, that we're using a relevant benchmark. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Brad. And I directly hand over to Yan Wang.
Hello. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me and introduce me. First of all, I'm here as an individual researcher. Previously, I've been working with Justin Lin in Beijing University for about 10 years. And I'm at the center in Boston University, working with Professor Gallagher. The paper by Brad Parks and al. Compares China's lenders and MDBs and DAC bilateral and some commercial lenders. Is very well done. It's timely, it's useful, and carefully executed. The information on the comparison is very valuable. The flow, one of the slides shows flow collateral is very useful and it's new to me. So Justin Lin and myself, we have been promoting for more transparency over the years in our books and the papers during my work with OECD DAC. And we proposed the Chinese government to promulgate the foreign aid law and the regulations for a clear definition of foreign aid and development cooperation. Also divide clearly between the role of each institution, lending institutions. I understand they have been using blended financing of these banks, but they have concessional loans and non-concessional loans, commercial loans. So the law should regulate and define clearly the different types of loans and the source of funding. So I would encourage the authors to look into why CDB is behaving like this, like a commercial bank. Perhaps it's related to a different source of funding. It's not state budget. The funding is not from state budget. The funding is from international bond market also. So I would encourage the authors to look into the reasons behind the behaviors. In general, I support the paper and think the paper is very well done. My main point is that the debt over GDP ratio is a misleading measure, and because it ignores the asset side. The correct measure is to use the public sector net worth, asset minus liability. It is a critical and better measure than GDP and then debt over GDP ratio. If the public sector net worth is positive, the country is having a liquidity problem. If the public sector net worth is negative, then the country is having a serious problem of insolvency. So for this theory, you can look at the IMF's Fiscal Monitor 2018. They also provided a database. So related to this argument, then I would say that China not only provide the lending, but also build public sector assets in developing countries, in the low-income countries, and providing valuable public services and public goods. So China works with other MDBs and bilaterals to build infrastructure and providing public goods. In a recent paper with Justin Lin, we used aiddata.com. We found that 214 completed infrastructure projects. And we found that these 214 hard infrastructure projects that have been completed in between 2000 and 2014, 78% have been matched with African countries' bottlenecks. That means nearly 80% of these infrastructure matched with Africa's bottlenecks, including their water facility, the hydropower stations, their railways, highways, airports, and the fiber optic lines for internet. So these are very crucial public infrastructure and assets. So China is providing public sector asset. So how can a country fight with COVID-19 without sufficient electricity and water? China's role in providing public assets and public goods should not be ignored. These infrastructure facilities are currently working in these low-income countries and providing services, critical services to people, including water, electricity, highways, and railways. So this is the second point. Third point is that currently, the current crises are in part a liquidity crisis due to pandemic and associated closing down and international trade and services, tourism. So it is not yet that crisis at this time, given the actions taken by G20 countries towards a debt service moratorium. In March and April, there was a sudden stop and unprecedented capital outflow from emerging markets, including African countries. So I have the data from the IIF, this
you come to an end.
in that large capital outflows. So the top priority for me, I think, is to promote the IMF to play the role of lender of last resort and issue more SDRs and issue more XDRs. This view has been supported by Professor Gallagher and his colleagues, and also the central bank governor of China. Let me end here, and I have other points that I can make later in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would give Brad the opportunity to briefly respond to the points made by Yan. And I would encourage others already to type their questions or comments they have on maybe both of the presentations. But yeah. Brad, would you like to respond?
Yeah, that'd be great. I think Yan's comments are really helpful, and there's two of them that I'd like to follow up on. The first question, and I think this is really foundational, is the question of CDB's motivations, right, and how their motivations might differ from other banks like China Exim Bank. So we know that China Exim Bank, through its concessional lending window, it gets subsidized. It doesn't have to maintain its own balance sheet for concessional loans. There's a formal system of reimbursement. They basically calculate the difference between the prevailing market interest rate, so what a commercial loan would look like if China Exim Bank offered, let's say, a commercial loan to Kenya, and then they measure the difference between the prevailing market rate and the actual concessional rate that they offer. And they use that for the Ministry of Finance, channeled through the Department of Foreign Aid and MOFCOM, to reimburse, to basically provide a financial transfer, a subsidy, so that China Exim Bank does not have to maintain its own balance sheet. I think CDB is much less clear. So they claim that they do not receive such subsidies. They claim that there's no formal program like that to kind of enable them to make loans below market rates. But if you kind of dig beneath the surface, it doesn't seem to be so clear cut. So my colleague, Anna Gelpern, just recently went and looked at CDB's public bond prospectus to see how do they define themselves. And here is the verbatim description from CDB. They describe themselves as, quote, a development financial institution wholly owned by the PRC central government and relying on state credit to raise medium and long-term funds, right? So they seem to be claiming, right, that they are an official creditor owned by the government and relying on state credit to, in turn, do their work. So I think that Yen's points very much resonated with me, because I think there's still much that we do not know about these differences, cross-creditor differences within China. The second point that I wanted to just follow up on is this point about blended finance. I think this is extremely important. So just for folks on the call who might not be immersed in this topic, China Exim Bank in particular, maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, introduced this instrument that they call mixed credits. And so if you think back to that project that I spotlighted, the standard gauge railway in Kenya, that was supported by two China Exim Bank loans, a commercial loan that was where the interest rate was tethered to the prevailing market rate. It's a LIBOR rate plus a margin. But then there's kind of a sister loan for the same exact project, which was at a concessional loan at a 2% interest rate with a substantially larger maturity. And so I think this is where a lot of the policy debate comes in about, which of these loans qualifies as foreign aid? Should these things be coupled together? Some of the export credit agencies of the OECD DAC claim that this practice undermines the gentleman's agreement that they signed in 1999 to avoid a race to the bottom among ECAs to provide ever more generous terms. So yeah, I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done to understand how China is blending concessional and commercial credit. I'll stop there.
So we continue with the second paper. We move from lending to Africa now to trade between Asia and Africa, and it's a big pleasure for us to welcome Hai-Wai Tang from the University of Hong Kong. He's professor of economics, obtained a PhD in economics from MIT. He's also associate director of the Institute for China and Global Development. And we are very proud at the Kiel Institute that he also joined us as a research fellow this summer. So he works on international trade, global value chains, development issues, and among others also on the China-Africa nexus. So it's a big pleasure to have you here. So I also welcome Tim Heinemann, who's also an economist. He obtained his PhD from Queen Mary, University of London, and he works at KfW Research. And the very topic of our online conference today is also reflects his research interests. So he works on structural and development issues in Africa. So I want to keep the introduction short, and I would like to hand over to Hai-Wai. We look forward to your presentation. So the next 15 minutes are yours.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for the introduction. Thank you for having me for this online conference. Let me congratulate Kiel Institute for launching both the Africa Initiative and the China Initiative online on this important day. Hope we are going to see each other more often, either in Asia or in Germany. I know I only have 15 minutes. I would probably rush through some of the slides. But let me at least give you a roadmap for what I'm going to say in the next 15 minutes. My job today is to talk about global value chains. Most of my research is really on China in the last few years. I started working on China-Africa relationship with David Dollar and Wen-Chi Chang on FDI from China to Sub-Saharan Africa. So my knowledge about Africa really started from that paper in 2016. I'm a newcomer to the field, and I'm looking forward to the comments from team and others. So very recently, I joined a project at the African Department of the World Bank to look at the trade relationship between Africa and Asia. It was a conscious decision to focus on not only China, but also Asia, because we have seen a lot of heterogeneity in terms of value chain development between the two continents. So the short statements that I want to make at this moment is, China has become a very important trade partner for many countries in the world. China is the most important trade partner with Africa as a whole, but individual African countries have other major trade partners. India is rising as an important one, Pakistan as well. Japan is still a very important trade partner with Africa. So there are lots of nuanced results in the regression, but I want to stay out this very clearly that China is in the game, but it's not the dominant player as many people have said. So I'm going to spend about 5 minutes to talk about my paper with David Dollar and Wen-Chi Chang published in World Bank Economic Review in 2018. The reason why I want to talk about that, even though it was already published and not the main reason why I'm here, is because there are lots of narratives in the paper that share with the current discussion on trade. And I think there are lots of controversies about China's engagement in Africa, which needs to be clarified. So let me start to go ahead and talk about some of the controversy. Right? So China's FDI in Africa has been rising. I realize the title is only up here. Why? And the peak of FDI flow to Africa was recorded in 2008. Obviously, that investment was driven by the central government at that time, which had an initiative in Africa. They had a big African summit in Beijing, and they were talking about reviving the economic relationship with Africa. So the initial investment were mostly concentrated in mining, oil, and a bit in transportation. The major recipients of those FDI flows in 2008 were Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, South Africa, Sudan, and Zambia. All right. Since then, FDI continued to increase into the continent until 2018, but the recipients in terms of countries and sectors have become a lot more diverse. Right. So this is sort of the first myth about Chinese FDI in Africa. Many people have thought that it must be into petroleum, mining, and natural resources. It was true at the initial stage of FDI flows, but later on it has become a lot more diverse. Another myth that we sort of debunk in the World Bank paper is China is a new player in the FDI game. Right? It is growing very fast. Again, until 2018, it has slowed down a little bit in recent time. But compared to Japan, for example, it was actually not a very important creditor in terms of FDI or foreign aid or loans. In terms of the overall stock of foreign assets, it's actually just slightly bigger than Germany. Okay, so the volume is around 2.4 trillion US dollars for China in 2015. It was close to $2 trillion for Germany. Okay, so it is rising fast, which is catching a lot of media attention. But in terms of the overall share in foreign assets, it is still a relatively small player, right? Although the growth is rising. So the controversy has been well mentioned in the media and many research in the past, right? So it's not that hard, especially a few years ago, to see headlines like the three that I listed here, right? So is China colonizing Africa? Is China issuing loans to increase the debt level of some of the emerging countries there? Hillary Clinton even claimed that China is creating a new colonial power in Africa. The former Secretary of State who accused China for sort of having predatory loan practices to get countries into the debt trap. So all this have been going on for a long time. I think one of the reasons for this sort of well-known controversy is because when we look at Chinese FDI in all the countries in the world, and specifically in Africa, they tend to be relatively more concentrated in the worst governing countries. What it means is, if you look at the usual rule of law measure or corruption index, we tend to see relatively more Chinese FDI in those countries compared to Western FDI in those countries, right? So, this chart shows you, if you put all the recipient countries in the world based on the rule of law measure, Chinese FDI into the lowest third in terms of rule of law measure is around 37% compared to global FDI in those countries, which is only 25%. Another more illustrative way to illustrate this is regress or plot Chinese FDI into recipient countries against one of the rule of law measures. If you look at the global FDI to those countries, you see a positive correlation, meaning that FDI from the West tend to go to the relatively better governed country, meaning those countries have better legal systems, better rule of law, and intellectual property protection. So if you look at Chinese FDI in recipient countries across the world, you see basically no relationship with the ranking in rule of law or similar measures. Okay? So that could be a reason for the controversy, making many people to think that Chinese FDI may indirectly empower some of the corrupt and politically unstable regimes. But then if you sort of go to the ground and talk to ordinary people in Africa, you may see a slightly different view about the attitude towards China or Chinese FDI or overall economic engagement. So Pew Survey has been doing research globally about countries' attitude towards China, and consistently African respondents would rank will have more positive view towards China compared to the respondents in Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Interestingly, in some of the surveys, you will actually have a more positive view among African respondents to China compared to the Chinese to China. Okay, so this is just a side point that I want to make, that overall, if you trust the Pew survey results, then majority of people that are being surveyed will hold a pretty positive view towards China or its engagement there. So the last point I want to make about my FDI paper is that it is not driven by politics entirely. Of course, given the economic and political structure in China, there is stronger involvement by the central government in some of the deals, especially if it involves big infrastructure development, mining, etc. An important aspect that has been overlooked before we wrote that paper is a lot of the small, medium-sized enterprises were investing in Africa as well. And they're not in natural resources or mining. They're actually in a lot of services, particularly those that are related to international trade, but also some primitive stage of industrialization. Okay, and there are just a lot of opportunities for Chinese companies to invest in Africa, given the demographic dividends that it can provide compared to the rest of the world, which is on average aging. When we look at the distribution of FDI in terms of the number of deals that are being signed and approved, they were widespread, right? Nigeria is always at the top because of its natural resources, but you do see FDI from China in almost every country in Africa. And in terms of the distribution across sectors, as I mentioned, a lot of them, or surprisingly, a lot of them were in services. A little bit in banking as well, a majority in facilitating international trade. When the FDI went to manufacturing, they're mostly in light manufacturing. As you can imagine, some of the African nations could provide stable labor supply, which are much cheaper than the labor cost in China today. In the interest of time, I'm not going to repeat what I said. You can look at FDI or loans. They give you a very similar picture, right? Mining is obviously important, but transportation is equally, if not more, dominant in terms of shares of FDI and loans. So the summary of that FDI paper is there are lots of small FDI transactions. Many of them are not in mining. ODI is uncorrelated with the measure of rule of law, maybe giving people the impression that China is helping some of the weak governance states. We ran a lot of regressions. If you're interested, please read my published paper in World Bank Economic Review to show that a lot of these investments are profit-driven, supported by strong economic rationales rather than geopolitically motivated. Okay, the last 5 to 10 minutes, I want to talk about trade and global value chains. So I don't have much time to talk about the data, but basically it's the publicly available trade data at the bilateral level, covering 46 African nations, 5,000 products for 16 years from 2000 to 2015. So if you look at the whole African continent and the trade patterns with China, you will realize that mining, raw materials, petroleum are still ranked the most important sector, but there is substantial heterogeneity that I want to highlight. And the heterogeneity is observed in many countries, but in today's presentation, I'm going to pick 3 countries to represent that heterogeneity. The first country that I want to talk about is Ethiopia. Ethiopia is not a petroleum mining concentrated country. It is still at a very early stage of manufacturing, but it is a very dynamic economy. Right? So when you look at the major export items in 2005, it was coffee, tea, and materials behind them. But in 10 years, it has successfully shifted from coffee and tea to oil seeds. So much of these exports are still sort of raw materials, raw beef, but we started seeing some processing and assembly involved in packaging those products as commercialized food products. Nigeria is another example which is very different from Ethiopia. It was always very concentrated in minerals, and it remained to be the case. It is trading a lot with Asia, but Nigeria's major trade partner is not China. Nigeria's main trade partner is India. So the phenomena that I want to highlight here is many countries, including those in West, are going to Africa for natural resources. It's not a China-specific phenomenon. India is doing the same in China. Ghana is the third country, and the last country I want to talk about. It was very concentrated in cocoa in 2005. It shifted almost 100% to natural and cultured pearls, which involve more labor input, which involve more skills.
You have 2 minutes left.
Great. It was able to diversify away from some of the low value-added products. As I mentioned at the very beginning, China is the major trade partner with Africa, but there's also major heterogeneity that I want to highlight. Ethiopia, major trade partner with China used to be Japan. But you look at Ghana, China was the major trade partner in 2005. It lost the gain to India, which is by far the largest trade partner with Ghana. Nigeria used to have Japan as a major trade partner. China was actually losing trade share with Nigeria to both Japan and also to India, which had over 63% export share from Nigeria. Okay, so 2 minutes is enough for me to talk about the Russian results because they're actually not much. The results are very nuanced. I wouldn't declare that trade with Asia has successfully moved the entire continent on value chains. But one very important and positive message that I want to highlight is export to Asia did not crowd out or replace African exports to the rest of the world, right? So if anything, there's no trade diversion. There's actually a lot of export complementarity. When countries become more specialized in trade exporting to Asia, they continue to export more in the same sector to non-Asian destinations. So if you look at economic theory, the only destination that you can come up with is really some economies of scale, which may come from externalities that maybe capacity has increased due to experience and skill set accumulated by exporting to Asia, and now their productivity allows them to increase production and export to other countries. Another economies of scale that I want to highlight is export involves a lot of fixed costs. Once they export to Asia, they can reduce or spread out the fixed costs to a larger volume of export, essentially reduce average trade costs, which facilitate more export to other countries. There's only one measure of global value chains that we find some relationship, which is the measure of upstreamness. So this is a very controversial measure in global value chains because you can argue upstream may represent more R&D, more high-tech manufacturing. But at the same time, in some of the resource-dependent countries, upstream does mean that there's more drilling, more mining at the top. So I wouldn't say the experience is the same for all the countries when they move up the value chains in terms of upstreamness. But we do see exports to Asia positively correlated with countries' overall upstream position in the export basket. And most of the countries that
come to an end. I'm sorry.
Okay, so this is the last table. Most of the countries that had a positive movement in the value chains in terms of upstreamness are those that are poor and those that are not landlocked next to the ocean, which are probably obvious in the sense that relatively less developed countries will have more room to move up the value chains. And if trade is that important, countries that are located in the right position to trade obviously benefit more from that positive impact. So actually don't have much to conclude. I already said everything on this slide. Trade is still concentrated in primary sector. Certain countries like Ethiopia and Ghana took advantage of this export opportunities to diversify their export portfolio. China is not a major country for some of the African nations in terms of trade. I have already mentioned economies of scale, which I think is the next step of this research, to really look at how export complementarity happens across destination countries. In terms of value chains, I think the experience is very heterogeneous across countries. The next step is really to understand why some countries will be able to move up in this 10 to 15 year of export opportunities. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Haiwei. So before we turn over to Tim Heinemann, please start typing questions either in the chat, or you can also raise your virtual hand when you get unmuted. So please start typing, and we move over to Tim Heinemann from KfW Research.
Yes, thank you both, and thank you especially Haiwei for sharing a very interesting paper with us today. I like the paper a lot because I think it speaks to one of the key debates in global economic policy, which is the emerging trade links between Africa and China, and particularly Asia. And I think what makes the paper very powerful is that it sheds some or provides some very conclusive data to a discourse which you have shown right at the beginning is often based on very superficial knowledge of these relations. It's based on gut feelings and not really simply engaging with the data at hand. And I think that makes your paper very interesting because it provides some very needed data to understand the relationship between Africa, Asia, and China in particular. And that's why I would like to put my focus on my today's discussion of the paper on the political sphere and the political relevance especially. You really clearly show that the relationship between Africa and Asia is geographically very diverse and economically diverse as well. Of course, China plays a huge role. That might also be because of its FDI engagement in the area and its long tradition of investing in the region. You also show that China engagement and Asia engagement in the region has contributed to some much needed diversification of trade, although it's still very tainted towards primary export of primary goods and resources. I think a question that sort of comes out of your paper, because you point out towards the trajectory each of these individual economy has taken in terms of trade over the last sort of 15 to 20 years, starting from 2005. You particularly point out to what I call the African five economies and how their trade has shifted towards some manufacturing good and some other forms of commodity. I sort of wonder whether this trend will actually continue when we enter sort of the kind of post-corona recovery in the world economy. You know, there's some sort of basic shift in the world economy as well over the last 20 years, the period you observe, which is China's entry to the WTO, the strong growth performance of China. I wondered how that actually can be repeated, because there have been very singular events, how that can be repeated when we go into the future. And of course, there are sort of other issues that might play into the performance of these African nations as well. There might be the trade war between China and the US. I mentioned the pandemic. And I also sort of, as you pointed out as well, the advent of or the advancement of India in these economic relations. So you wonder how they will pan out in the future, sort of trade relations between Asia and Africa, and how that will sort of might continue or help to diversify the export base. Yes, I would like to leave it for now in the interest of time. There's so much in the paper, so I could continue, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. So before we open the discussion, we would like to give Haiwei the possibility to reply. So Haiwei, maybe focus on one or two points just for the sake of time. We would really also like to open up.
Sure. Thank you, Tim, for the praise and also the discussion. I think you're right. The world has changed quite a lot since 2018, in particular in the last half a year. It is still very early to tell what globalization will look like, but certainly the deglobalization trend has started a few years ago and it will continue right after Corona. And I think the Chinese government, based on the current initiatives that I heard from Beijing, is to use trade as a complement to sort of establishing domestic supply chains. Part of the reason is really risk diversification, right, in preparation for continuous pressure from the US and maybe increasingly from other Western countries as well. I haven't heard too much about, the sort of investment initiative in Africa, partly because everyone is still sort of recovering from the damage of the COVID-19. But at least in April, the Beijing government has come out and say there will be another round of debt forgiveness to some of the debtors, many of them in Africa. So I guess the Chinese government attitude right now is to hold a wait and see approach. In the near future, I'm expecting, again, based on what I've seen in the trade data as well as some policy documents coming from Beijing, there will be more consolidation of trade relationship between China and Southeast Asia, rather than the relationship between China and Africa and the US. Again, it's still early to tell what is going to go on, but we started seeing sort of decreasing economic engagement in terms of FDI as well as in terms of trade between China and Africa as a whole. Part of the reason is because we are already behind, or the super commodity cycle is already way over, right? So trade from Africa is heavily dominated by natural resources. When the prices of oil and other raw materials decline, then it will affect trade numbers, but also the performance of some of those natural resource dependent countries. I guess some of the more vibrant industrial-based dependent countries in Africa may be more prepared to take some of the spin-off from the US-China economic tension, and some of the globalization is going to increase the fragmentation of production chains. Maybe some of those more developed African nations will be able to enjoy some of the spin-offs from the existing China-dominated supply chains.
So thanks again, and I'm happy to hand it over to Katana for the panel discussion.
Andy, for handing over to me, and welcome everybody to the second half of the China-Africa conference of the Kiel Institute. That is the opening conference of the Kiel Africa Initiative and the China-Africa Initiative. My name is Katana Kajavi, and I'll be your host and the moderator of this event. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Kiel Institute, and I'm also the Executive Director of the Poverty Reduction, Equity and Growth Network, PEGNET, which is hosted by the Kiel Institute. So that being said, I would like to proceed to welcome my distinguished guests to the panel. I will start with Christoph Trelbesch. Christoph Trelbesch is a professor of economics at the University of Kiel. He is a professor of macroeconomics, and he's also a head of the research area at the Kiel Institute. He heads the research area on international finance and global governance. Welcome, Christoph. The second guest that we have is Hannah Ryder. Hannah Ryder is the CEO of Development Reimagined, which is an international development consultancy that is based in Beijing. And before that, Hannah Ryder has a really broad profile, and she worked as a diplomat for the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. Prior to that, she was also with DFID, the United Kingdom's Department for International Development. We're happy to have you on this panel, Hannah. Welcome. The last speaker, but of course not least, is our very distinguished guest, Justin Lin. Professor Lin is at the Peking University in Beijing. There he is the Dean of the Institute for New Structural Economics. He's at the same time also the Dean for the Institute on South-South Cooperation and Development, Prior to that, he worked at the World Bank and was the chief economist from 2008 to 2012, and also the senior vice president at the World Bank. I also should mention that he is one of the leading experts on industrialization and structural transformation. So we're very happy to have all of you on this panel. Welcome, Justin Lin, as well. It is a pleasure for me to be able to sit with you virtually and to be able to moderate this panel. I will just go ahead and begin to ask questions. So, Christoph Trebesch, recently there was a lot of media outcry based on some of the work that you had done on China. You received a lot of attention from different media outlets for a paper that you wrote on overseas Chinese lending. And one of the things that was really striking is that you show that 50% of debt, or 50% of international finance from China is hidden debt and is very difficult to document. I would like to find out how you came about this, and I would also like to ask you to focus on the risks and the opportunities that you see from China's international finance that is very opaque. Could you please tell us a little bit more about this and your impression on the chances and opportunities that come from the situation?
Yes, so thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be part of this initiative and look forward to more involvement of the Kiel Institute on issues regarding China's footprint abroad, but also especially with regard to Africa. So on your question, I mean, I think there's three points. One is the first point to look at is just how large China's footprint has become. So China, as we document in that paper, now owes more than the claims of China now exceed 6% of world GDP towards the rest of the world. So the world has become heavily indebted to China. That is true for advanced countries and developing countries. For developing countries, we then compile a new data set from a variety of sources. So we go after each and every of those loans that Brad, Deborah Breutigam, Kevin Gallagher, and all these different researchers have done on the various regions of the world. We combine all that together, create a consensus data set loan by loan, and then use the lending flows to compute stocks. So we puzzle it all together and try to estimate the level of debt that each country owes to China. And from this systematic data gathering exercise, we know what the consensus is according to a data and all these other data sets. So we know how much debt outstanding is according to those sources, and we can compare that to the debt outstanding that the World Bank has recorded. And we do that by comparing it to the 2017 extract of the debt reporting system. And there we find that the World Bank seems to capture only 50% of the total lending amount of China towards the rest of the world. Now, we can start debating whether it's 60 or 40% or whatever. What is certain is that there is a big transparency problem here, and large chunks of the lending just have flown under the radar, right? And one reason is that China often lends to state or the enterprises, not to the government itself. And the countries have not registered this debt systematically and not reported it to the World Bank. So in other words, the data we have used from the IMF, from the World Bank, misses a big chunk of debt, and this has implications in multiple regards. The first one is country surveillance is very difficult, and debt sustainability analysis is very difficult if you don't know how much these countries owe to China. Say you are an investor, you want to know how risky Ghana is, how risky Mozambique is. You need to know the debt stocks and the liabilities, and when the coupons come due and all that. And this is a big problem. Transparency in general is a big problem, not just with regard to China, but I think we need a global push for debt transparency. Public debt must be public information. And currently, we have the debt to GDP numbers, okay, but we don't know the granular details, and we need those. Every citizen should know who their country owes money to and when payments are flowing. And I think we need a big push there. So let me say one more thing. We have seen this movie before, right? So currently we're debating on transparency issues, intercreditor equity issues. In the 1970s and 1980s, we already had a boom towards poor African countries that are commodity rich. it ended in a big tragedy of the 1980s debt crisis with 10 to 20 years of debt overhang, debt relief initiatives, low growth, and all that. We should learn from this experience and avoid another lost decade in Africa. And I think transparency and getting the data together and knowing exactly what is going on the liability side. And I haven't spoken about all the opportunities that often go along with this project, right? So we shouldn't, I'm a debt guy, so I look at the risks, okay? But those risks, a first order condition is really we need to know the details. We need to know what is going on. And we have seen this moment before. Also in the 1970s, it was the Western banks that were not transparent, right? It was the commercial banks. It was, the city banks, the Deutsche banks. They had lent enormous amounts. Nobody had an idea how much, and it all ended in tears. We should avoid that. We need transparency, and we need other legal tools in the global system, but I don't have time to talk about those.
You raised interesting points. So you present a lot of risks. You mentioned that you're the debt person and you would look at the risks, but at the same time, there's still definitely a pool that attracts these countries to lending from China. And I would just like to understand the dynamics a bit better. What is it that the Chinese government is offering to these state-owned enterprises that they cannot get from other international lenders? What has changed? So you mentioned how in the 80s a similar process took place and lending came from Western countries, but now many African countries are turning to China. And what is it in Chinese debt that attracts these countries to China? So you would have to unmute your mic, sorry.
Okay. So it's always a mix of push and pull, right? It's always the lenders and it's the creditors. It's a mix of the two, right? So China has been offering these credit and investment packages. They offer attractive infrastructure and energy extraction projects that, fill important gaps in these countries, right? And these countries are, by definition, scarce in capital, scarce in infrastructure, and China is offering something. So it's a mix of China, going out, right, going global. That was the explicit strategy of China's government in the 2000s, go global. So that's the push. And the pull, these countries are want to benefit from these offers, and the credit is offered to them just as it was offered to them in the 1970s when the oil money from the OPEC countries in the oil crisis was basically recycled via Western banks and were offered in a similar way to developing countries. So it's always a part of the responsibilities with the countries, part of the responsibilities with the creditors, and the risk is that these countries, and this is again a movie that comes again and again, is that they overload themselves. They become too ambitious. Both the creditor and the lender become too ambitious, become too optimistic. The commodity prices are booming. You think that all these revenues will be coming along, and then you overlend. And then the problem is that it's very hard to get rid of all the debt accumulated, to get rid of the debt mountain and to exit the debt distress situations again.
So I would like to speak to Justin now, who recently published a book entitled China, Africa, and Economic Transformation. And some of the points that you raised, Justin, are very similar to what Christoph just raised. So you provide a history in the introduction of the book of how China-Africa engagement came about. One thing that Christoph did not mention as he was discussing the risks, and that I would like you to highlight upon, is what the risks are for China, of course. So we're currently in the middle of a global pandemic, which might lead to a recession, and yet we see that the numbers keep on rising of debt that is issued by China and international finance. And I would just like to know from your perspective, what do you think China has to lose by this? Because they are definitely going global and expanding their strategy. But are there any downsides to this, or trade-offs that China is facing?
China treat African countries as an opportunity for investment in a win-win situation, because And the debt to African country is loan from China. And certainly China has a high incentive to make the project successful. Otherwise, China will lose the money. And Chris mentioned the similarity about the debt ratio rising now compared to the 1970s. But there's one thing different. In the 1970s, most of those debt was used for consumption type of activities. And once you consume that, nothing left over. But this time, most of the debt were used for investment in infrastructure. And you have, assets building up because of infrastructure. And those kind of infrastructures, in most cases, release the bottlenecks of the growth in African countries. And that make the project, will have the ability to generate revenue to repay the debt. And I think this is a very important difference between the debt now and the debt in previous decades. Certainly, I agree with Chris. Transparency will be desirable. But at the same time, we also need to understand the difference in the nature of the debt. Otherwise, easily will refer in the past because there's no transparency. So the country was trapped in a very serious situation. And so we should not have, this debt anymore. But if without the investment in infrastructure, I think African country will not be able to, have a successful structural transformation, because we know that certainly African country, no matter it's in agriculture or in industrialization, you need to have infrastructure. In agriculture, for example, irrigation, and also if you want to export your agricultural produce, you also need to have, road and a port. And industrialization, certainly, you need to have electricity, you need to have road network and port facilities. So we need to see this difference, before we say, well, it's high risk for African countries.
But what about the risks for China? So China is indeed investing in Africa and providing this finance. But at the same time, in some African countries, the returns might not be as clear for China, especially if they're focusing on the repayment as the end goal and structural transformation. And do you see this as a trade-off for China? Could this investment or this finance be put elsewhere?
Well, I think that certainly, just like banks, when they give loan to anyone, there's a risk. Then, the lender, the borrower will not be able to pay back the debt. And that means China needs to have some kind of, careful studies about the feasibility, about the possibility for paying back the debt, whether the project is viable or not. And Chinese government is keen to make sure the project will be successful. But certainly there are some kind of unexpected events like COVID-19. Those things no one expected. But even the best bank or even other international organizations, I think they were also caught in surprise. And that's common to every country, that unique to China. But, when you want to make an investment or you want to engage any kind of business, certainly there are risks there. But we cannot say because there are risks, but we should not engage with African countries.
So I would like to switch to Hannah now. So what I really like about your consultancy is how you have this dual perspective. So on the one hand, you have an African-owned consultancy that is based in Beijing, and you provide advice to African businesses that want to set up in China. And on the other hand, you also provide advice to Chinese businesses that want to go to Africa. So I like how you have this weight approach in your consultancy, and I would like to hear what your take on the risks and chances that have been described by Christoph and by Justin. What would you tell an African government who has received an offer from China then?
Thank you so much, Katana, and also to the Kiel Institute. Congratulations for this initiative, and also thank you for the opportunity to join such a distinguished panel. And also very excellent papers we heard earlier on in the discussion. It was really excellent to be to hear all of the new analysis. Now, we do also advise African governments and Chinese counterparts on some of these issues. And in terms of the aspect around debt, I would like to leave you with one phrase, I guess, which is from an African perspective. And that's what we really try to bring to a lot of this analysis. And we tend to see that perspective is often lacking. And that's what we try to bring to the discussion. Now, if you look at the quality and quantity of debt, as Justin was saying, both of those things are very important. In terms of quantity, we are at around 1978 levels of debt across Africa. The majority in just a few countries, not widespread. But once you add it all up, it's around 1978. So all those figures that you see of rising debt over the last few years, that is over the last few years, but do a longer timeline and you understand the context, which raises the question of what do we mean by sustainability? And there's even been a question in the chat around that debtors have sustainability issues. Sustainability is a determination from analysis by the IMF and others with specific thresholds, and it's unclear what those thresholds are based on. They may be based on the past, but again, what that might not take into account, for instance, is issues around quality of debt. So, are those levels sustainable if you are investing in infrastructure, if you're investing in a whole range of other types of, if you're taking out loans for a range of different activities. And what they also don't take into account is a full global perspective. So most data and most analysis is based on developing countries because that's the analysis, that's the structure that we've been in. We have typically World Bank, IMF use analysis of developing countries. That's what most researchers working on development we look at on their own. We don't really very much look at what global shifts have been. So there are some questions around the structure of the system and the structure of our analysis of what sustainability is, and in particular in the context of SDGs. And African countries, other low-income countries, need to meet the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. What is sustainability in that context? What is debt sustainability in that context? And how do you marry those two approaches? And it's not clear that debt sustainability analysis as it exists at the moment, as it's carried out at the moment, really does that in the right way. The other aspect in terms of quantity is obviously repayment, so interest rates and what sorts of levels those are. I know the analysis earlier about contracts was looking at some of the questions of contracts, but those issues around repayment are also very important to consider and to understand in terms of sustainability and the types of growth that the investments themselves will elicit. So there needs to be a lot more analysis of those questions from an African perspective in order to come to better answers on these issues. And just to reiterate the point that Justin was making on quantity, on quality, it is clear that African countries are trying to invest in partnership with China and through loans with China, trying to invest into infrastructure and industrialization in particular, which are key goals in terms of sustainable development for African countries. And so we have to take that into account as well. That doesn't mean, Christoph was talking about transparency. Transparency is very important. Transparency to African citizens is very important. These countries need to have a clear strategy that they share with their citizens around how are we engaging with China, in the same way that they would say, look, what is our strategy with the UK? What is our strategy with the US? Where is that relationship going? We encourage African countries to do just that. And that kind of transparency of where that relationship is going can set the tone for these sorts of discussions, as opposed to research which might be not necessarily in context and not necessarily comparative either, because the other question is how does China compare to others, and that can also be revealing in itself.
Thank you for highlighting the 2 points on quality and quantity, also on debt sustainability, Hannah. And Justin got me thinking. So he mentioned how COVID-19 came as a surprise not only to China, but also to other international lenders and development programs. And I'm just curious how you think quality might change. So I know Christoph, and we'll get back to you in a bit, has a paper where he looks at how lending changes after a crisis. And he shows that the amount of lending, so the quantity that you just addressed, increases after a crisis. And I just want to find out what your take is, Hannah. How do you think the COVID-19 crisis that caught us unawares is going to affect the quality and quantity of debt, and how this can be managed in a more sustainable way, knowing what we have known from the 1970s example that you mentioned and the current debt situation? How do you think COVID-19 is going to play a role in changing the debt scenario?
Well, so I think there's a number of issues. First of all, COVID-19 means that countries do have to spend. What many African countries have been doing is taking very strong actions to curb COVID-19 in order not to have to spend and deal with overwhelmed health systems, right? This is the key that they've been trying to avoid, and the Africa CDC has been very, very helpful in trying to help that happen and encourage that coordination. So there was a possibility that many countries would be in a South Africa case where they were really overwhelmed. There's still that possibility, of course, through several waves. But the aim is really to keep that spending down as much as possible. That said, of course, they're having to spend and obviously having to also do a number of social protection programs. Our consultancy, we've estimated that the social protection programs that have been put in place will reach 175 million people across the continent, which is significant. And it is important because in the context of potentially rising poverty, if governments are taking action to try to support their public, provide cash transfers to vulnerable people, then that can help to curb poverty. So we again have to have the whole picture, not just one side of the picture. And then when it comes to debt, in order for countries to be able to shift spending into health and these cash transfers or other types of social protection programs, they need to find some fiscal room. And of course, there's several countries for whom they don't have much fiscal space because there's a number of different things that they spend on, of course. Debt repayments is one of those things. Fossil fuel subsidies is another. There's a whole range of different types of spending that the governments make. So where can they find haircuts? Debt repayment is an obvious one that in principle can easily be supported. And the G20 has said that they will suspend debt repayments for the lowest income countries. But again, that isn't enough because that leaves out a number of African countries who are classified as middle income and have exactly the same issues. Some of them have actually got higher COVID-19 rates than others, and even larger, very large populations in poverty. And then the private sector is not participating in that. Multilateral banks are giving out loans rather than cancelling those debt repayments. And those loans then come with 5-year repayment terms, although they are emergency facilities. So it is possible that these countries will be in a more difficult situation coming out of this, but this will be in the same way that the 1980s debt crisis arose, probably of not of their doing, but to do with the challenges of the structure that they're having to fit in. Which is why, you know, I have, for example, proposed creating a borrowers club for countries to try to get much reduced rates of loans to be able to manage future infrastructure financing and other types of debt financing. And there's a whole range of other suggestions, for example, special drawing rights to help the poorest countries, or those countries in the biggest challenges, including in Africa. So those are really important proposals to be considering. They're not yet being taken seriously enough. My hope is that they will be, and otherwise it will become a predictable, bigger crisis, even though it is not African countries' fault.
Thank you, Hannah. Christoph, do you have anything to say on that?
Yes, thanks so much. So I'm very sympathetic to the quality argument, right? What is the debt used for? What is frustrating about the current debate is that it's a lot of speculation and very little facts. Some say that these Chinese loan and projects are big investment, they're white elephants, you know, there's a highway that raises debt by 10 or 20% to GDP, right? Huge debts for just one railway or one highway, right? That doesn't sound like quality. But we know that there are many, many projects that are highly valuable to these countries as well, right? And then there's others who say, on average, this is a big win-win, right? The problem is that as long as we don't have the data, we can't say who is right. We can't say whether the net debt after accounting for assets is really so much lower than the gross debt, right? Probably it is, and I am a big fan of assets and liability, of combining the two. But what you need, and why the IMF, for example, does not do the IMF debt sustainability analysis by including assets, is that there is no good data on assets. And in the case of China and Africa, there's a very simple solution. 2/3 of all the projects are financed by two banks. These two banks are owned and controlled by the State Council. So the State Council of China could say, I release all the details of all the projects, and I release all the details of all the loans. And then I let dozens of enthusiastic researchers around the world jump on that data and analyze rates on returns, analyze interest rates, compare the value of the asset, compare the value of the debt, and then we know how much this debt is a risk and how much the projects are a asset and a benefit. Until we don't have that, until we don't have the micro data and the details, right? Until then, and we live in an age where we have the computational capacity, we have the intellectual skills to work with this kind of big data. So it could be released. I understand that there are confidentiality issues and all that, but the data could be released probably in ways that account for these issues. And I think at least the research community would be amazed, the policy community would be more informed, and we could learn for the next crisis coming. So, you know, it's probably 6 months of work to do that, and it could be easily done if the will is there. And that's not just China, by the way. All governments could release details on their assets and on their investments abroad, as well as on the liability side. Right? I mean, there's nothing that hinders governments from like there's no logistical issues. It's a political decision. So this is a problem that can be very clearly answered. It's just that there's little political will in clicking on the release data button.
Thank you very much, Tristan, for your contribution. I have many follow-up questions, but I just realized that we have been talking about debt for a bit. And of course, this session is not only about debt, but we're really looking at all aspects of Africa and China's engagement. And I would like to go back to Justin, who painted a rather rosy picture when you talked about how China's support is trying to foster a structural transformation, and that is why it's investing in infrastructure to support projects that are already underway in many African countries. And while this sounds very convincing and enticing for many African governments, we know, reading from many reports, that this is actually not the case when at the ground level. And I would just like to have your take on this as well, Justin. What about all the reports that talk about negative relations and negative China not respecting international labor laws? What about the reports of cultural clashes between Chinese workers and local African workers? Do you have anything to say that might counterbalance some of the positive messages you say? So I would like to have your word on this before we open the question and answer session.
Okay, very good. Before I answer a question, I think I'm sympathetic to Chris, his pleas for, data acceptability and so on, and make them public. And that certainly will be the best situation. But before that, we cannot just stop and complain. And in fact, there are already some, estimation about the data and so on, just like the aid data. They collect all the information that they can collect, assemble. Although they may not be perfect, but I think that they at least reflect 95% of the realities. And so maybe we can start to work on the issue about the discernibility using the data set. And certainly we can continue to advocate that all the government in the world should be transparent, release all the data that to all the citizens, right? So that's my response to your comments. And secondly, certainly just like the sustainability issue, and there's a lot of report about the mistreatment of the workers or the Chinese investor. They brought all the workers from China and would not employ local workers. We have a lot of those kind of negative report. But if you go to the fields and to collect the data, you find, actually the Chinese firm employ more African workers than the Western firms in the same country. And so again, just like Chris, we need to have more, studies on the, cases and make them available. Otherwise, people will be misinformed. And from what I see, China may present the best opportunity for African countries to, meet the SDG, to reduce poverty, because we know currently African countries, have the largest concentration of poverty. And if you want to reduce poverty, structural transformation would be essential, because we know all the countries, including those in the West, they started with poverty. So when they were poor, they all rely on agriculture and resources for living. And if they want to remove and reduce the poverty, they need to move from agrarian economy, resources-based economy to manufacturing and climb up industrial ladders. And when you try to have this kind of transformation, you need to start with labor-intensive industries, and you need to tap into the potential of relocation of labor-intensive industry from high-income countries. And China now reached the stage to release its labor-intensive industry to African countries and other developing countries. And I think that if African countries can capture these opportunities, then African countries can grow dynamically like other East Asian countries. So I think that they present the best opportunities. And if you want to capture these opportunities, certainly you also need to improve infrastructure. So from what I see, China provides these two opportunities simultaneously. China will move up the industrialities, will, we leave open the opportunity for other countries to grasp. And African countries need to grasp this opportunity. But if they want to capitalize this opportunity, they need to improve infrastructure. And at the same time, China also provide those kind of opportunities. So for me, it will be important for African countries to understand that. And so that's why we published the book and write articles to inform the African country. But certainly, at the end, the decision should be made by African country how to benefit from that.
So we have a question from one of the attendees who would also like to know whether African countries are getting value for money when borrowing from China. So they refer to tide aid, forcing African nations to buy Chinese state-owned enterprises who are probably colluding for infrastructure projects. So Justin, you just talked about infrastructure projects, and what is your answer to this question then?
I think that now most of the projects is on the open bids. And China certainly has the competitive advantages to offer the project in a much more affordable process. So you look into the project is financed by China, and the construction company is from China. But the reason why the construction companies are from China because they are most competitive. So in that sense, I don't think it's a tie end. It's just because China, has the competitive advantages in the construction sectors in the world today.
That was very brief and compact and straight to the point, but with very valuable information. Thank you very much for your insights. And you've given us a lot of work to look forward to in the future. We hope that you will be part of the efforts of the Kiel Institute's Africa and China initiative. We know that you have both cooperated with us in the past. Hannah, you've written several policy briefs for the Kiel Institute and you have also spoken at the Global Solutions Summit. Justin, we were also really pleased to have you as a keynote speaker at one of our events in the past, and we hope that we will be able to continue this collaboration. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us today for the opening conference of the Kiel Institute Africa and China Initiative. And to the attendees who are also following this conference, thank you very much for your time. And please take a look at our website for any more additional information that you might have. We're in the beginning of setting up this initiative, and we would be very happy for your feedback. As our president mentioned in the beginning of this conference, this is a platform that is open to all experts who are interested in China and Africa. And this is a community that we want to use to build together, collect better data, as was mentioned by all of you, and to just enhance the knowledge on this topic. So I would like to thank you all for joining us today. And I look forward to collaborating with you in the future. Thank you so much.